In the dimly lit corridors of Hampton Court, whispers of her name still linger, like perfume that refuses to fade. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of King Henry VIII, the girl who danced her way into the crown and screamed her way into history. She was not a queen of wisdom, nor of politics, nor even of ambition. She was a child made to play at being a woman. And in that cruel theatre called the Tudor Court, youth was the most dangerous costume of all. Her story begins not with power, but with hunger, the hunger of a noble family for status, and of a king for the illusion of love that would make him feel alive once more. The year was 1540, and the Kingdom of England was tired. Its king, now approaching 50, was no longer the golden prince of his youth. His body was swollen, his leg ulcerous, his breath fouled by disease. He had torn his country from Rome, executed 2 wives, and broken a dozen hearts. But still he could not escape the emptiness gnawing inside him. Then came Catherine, a girl of 17, radiant, soft, and unscarred by the weight of the world. She was everything he had lost. When she laughed, he felt his own blood stir again. When she smiled, he believed God had forgiven him for his sins. He called her his rose without thorns. But roses, as history loves to remind us, never grow without blood. Her family, the ambitious Howards, saw their chance. The Duke of Norfolk whispered that the king's heart could yet be conquered by beauty. They placed Catherine at court as lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, a Queen Henry already despised. The girl did not need to seduce him. Her mere presence was enough. She was light in a dark room, the flutter of silk among iron men. Within weeks, the king's obsession burned brighter than reason. The marriage to Anne was annulled. On a summer morning that same year, Henry stood beside Catherine and declared her his wife. His joy, his new beginning. But beginnings in the Tudor world were only preludes to endings. The marriage that promised renewal soon became a reflection of decay. Catherine smiled, but behind the jewels and silks, she suffocated. The king's affection was possessive, heavy, absolute. His leg bled constantly. The infection filled their chambers with a stench that no perfume could hide. He needed her youth to feel immortal. But she, still barely a woman, found herself tied to a body already half in the grave. Loneliness crept into her days. And then, out of that loneliness, came a face from her past. Francis Derham, the man she had once called husband in the dim dormitories of Chesworth House. Long before she knew what danger was, he reminded her of freedom, of the girl she had been before. She became a queen. She made the mistake of giving him employment in her household, a gesture that would one day cost her everything. For within the walls of the court, secrets did not sleep. While Henry's attention turned to politics, Catherine's heart turned toward another man, Thomas Culpeper. Young, handsome, and daring. Their glances met across corridors like sparks in a palace soaked in oil. They met in secret, their letters trembling with the kind of love that forgets fear until it is too late. "It makes my heart to die," she wrote. "To think I cannot always be with you." That sentence, once tender, would become evidence at her trial. The whispers began small, carried by servants who saw too much. Then they grew. Archbishop Cranmer heard them, investigated them, and brought the king proof of his young wife's betrayal. Henry refused to believe it at first, but when he read Catherine's letters, his world cracked. The king, who had once defied Rome, now wept like a betrayed child. His love turned instantly to loathing. The girl who had been his rose became his thorn. Catherine was arrested at Hampton Court. When soldiers came for her, she screamed for Henry, shouting that she would see him, that she would speak to him once more. But the king, hiding in his chamber, would not come. She was taken to the Tower, The same tower that had swallowed her cousin Anne Boleyn 6 years before. The same stones that had heard laughter now echoed with the sobs of another doomed queen. The trial was a formality. The verdict? A certainty. Her lovers were tortured. Francis Derham was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Thomas Culpeper was beheaded. Jane Rochford, the woman who had helped arrange their meetings, went mad before her execution, and Catherine, barely 19, was left to prepare for the block. Witnesses said she practiced placing her head upon it, determined to die gracefully, to leave behind at least a fragment of dignity in a world that had taken everything else. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, the cold wind cut across the courtyard of the tower. Catherine Howard walked to the scaffold in a gown of black velvet. Her hands did not tremble. She said few words only, that she had wronged the king, but wished all men could pray for her soul. The crowd waited in breathless silence as the executioner raised his blade. When it fell cleanly. The sound that followed was the hush of a nation that had learned, once again, that love and death were never far apart in Henry's England. She was buried without a coffin, in an unmarked grave near her cousin Anne. The king did not attend. He never spoke her name again. But he dreamed of her. In his last years, the image of Catherine laughing, trembling, pleading haunted him as no living enemy ever had. The court moved on. The kingdom changed. But her story stayed, whispering through the corridors of history. Catherine Howard was not a villain, nor a saint. She was a reflection of the world that made her a child turned into a trophy, a bride turned into a warning. And though centuries have passed, her scream still lingers somewhere inside the tower walls, soft as breath, sharp as memory. For there are some deaths that do not end. They echo, long after the blade has fallen. Now, leave a comment and prepare to enter the shadows of Tudor. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Before she ever touched a crown, Catherine Howard was a child of shadows, not the silken, perfumed shadows of palaces, but the kind that live in cold corridors, between the whispers of neglect and the laughter of those too young to know they are being watched. She was born around the year 1523, into the noble but threadbare branch of the powerful Howard family. They were a clan of ancient blood, but dwindling fortune, feeding on the memory of past glory, while struggling to maintain the illusion of grandeur. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, was a failure in both ambition and responsibility, the kind of man who carried titles like debts, proudly, but without substance. Her mother, Jocasta, died when Catherine was still a child, leaving her to the mercy of a family that viewed affection as weakness. It was decided that she would be sent to live with her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, whose household at Chesworth was filled with Ward's noble children whose parents were dead, absent, or indifferent. The Duchess herself was old, proud, and careless, a matriarch ruling over a house where decency was observed only when she was awake. At night, the rules melted away. The girls whispered, the boys prowled, the servants looked the other way. And it was in that world of half-light that Catherine learned what it meant to survive, to smile when frightened, to charm when cornered, to use innocence like armor. She was 13 when her music teacher, Henry VIII, began to show her attention that felt thrilling and confusing all at once. He praised her beauty, her wit, her laughter, words that no one else had bothered to give her. He taught her the power of being noticed, but also the danger of being desired. It was not love, it was instruction. When she grew tired of him, another man stepped into that same void. Francis Derham, older, stronger, more persuasive, a man who knew how to twist tenderness into possession. In the dim dormitory, where the girls slept in rows, He whispered promises of marriage, of protection, of a future. She believed him, as any child would believe the first person who spoke to her softly. Those months at Chesworth would later become the evidence that killed her. What she thought were moments of secret affection were remembered by others as nights of sin. The girls who had giggled beside her would one day stand before men in robes and recount everything they had seen or imagined. The Duchess, when questioned years later, would claim she had known nothing. That was true enough. She had not cared to know. Catherine's youth was not guarded, her reputation not protected. She was, like so many girls of her rank, a pawn waiting for the right player to notice. Yet there was something luminous about her even then. Visitors to the Duchess's household remembered a girl whose laughter could change the air in a room, whose eyes seemed to hold more curiosity than fear. She danced when there was music. She sang when there was silence. And though she had so little power, she carried herself as if the world would one day bow to her. Perhaps it was fate. Perhaps it was the inherited arrogance of the Howards. But it made her irresistible to men who believed beauty was destiny. By the time she reached 15, her family's ambitions had begun to circle her like vultures. The Duke of Norfolk, head of the clan, saw her as a chance to reclaim favour at court. His niece, Anne Boleyn, had once worn the crown and lost her head for it. Another Howard, rising beside the king, could restore what was lost. Catherine, with her bright face and unguarded charm, became their unspoken project, a glittering key to power, though she herself had no idea what doors she was about to open. When she was summoned to court as lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, it must have felt like a dream. Gone were the cold dormitories, the giggling girls, the forgotten lessons on music and manners. In their place came velvet, jewels, and the scent of opportunity. The young courtiers watched her arrive, a fresh blossom among women, hardened by years of politics, and even they could see how her light caught the eye of every man in the room. She was innocence, polished into temptation. And in the Tudor court, that was a fatal combination. The court itself was a stage of glittering cruelty. Beneath the laughter of banquets and the hum of lute music lay a network of spies, informants, and ambition sharper than any blade. Queen Anne of Cleves was kind but foreign, too practical to excite a king who wanted to be adored. Henry, now a bloated shadow of the athlete he had been, seethed with embarrassment over his failed marriage. When he saw Catherine, her golden hair, her gentle voice, her effortless youth, he mistook her for redemption. She was the memory of his past, and he wanted to own it. At first, it was innocent. The king invited her to dance, to sing, to sit near him, while courtiers watched with cautious smiles. He called her my little one, a term that should have sounded tender but carried the weight of something darker, a grown man's desire to possess youth itself. Catherine had no choice but to play along. Her family encouraged it. Her uncle whispered that she was the answer to all their prayers. She had been raised to obey, not to think, and so she smiled when she was told to smile, bowed when she was told to bow, and believed that love, even royal love, might protect her from everything that frightened her. But those who had seen Anne Boleyn's fate knew better. The same charm that lifted a girl to the throne could just as easily drag her to the block. Catherine's rise was as swift as lightning, and lightning always strikes twice in Tudor England. When Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled, he wasted no time. He married Catherine in the summer of 1540. In a ceremony wrapped in gold and irony, a man dying from within, joined to a girl who barely understood the meaning of forever. The court rejoiced. The Howards celebrated. England sighed with relief, believing that the new queen's youth would soften the king's temper. For a moment, it seemed to work. Henry smiled again, laughed again, even walked with less pain. He wore his crown like a man reborn. Catherine played her role perfectly. though the shadow of her past, the dormitory nights, the whispered vows with Francis Derham lingered behind her like a ghost. At first, no one dared mention it. The king's happiness was too precious to disturb. But the truth has a way of finding its voice. And in Tudor England, truth was always fatal. The servants, who had once shared her secrets, began to talk. The men who envied her family began to listen. And somewhere in the echo of her laughter, fate began its slow, deliberate approach. Still, for that brief, shining moment, Catherine Howard stood at the centre of a world that had always looked past her. The girl who grew up among ghosts had become a queen, the one thing she had never dreamed of being. The halls of Hampton Court glowed with music. Her gowns shimmered in torchlight, and the king's gaze followed her every step. To the courtiers, she looked untouchable. To the poets, she looked divine. But to history, she was already marked. For the same innocence that once made her beloved would soon make her dangerous. And in a kingdom built on suspicion, beauty was never a gift. It was a curse waiting to be claimed. The night before her coronation, as she walked through the silent corridors, perhaps she remembered Chesworth, the cold dormitories, the laughter, the hands that once promised safety and instead taught fear. Perhaps she looked into her mirror and saw not a queen, but the frightened child who had learned long ago that in the dark, every kindness comes at a price. And as dawn broke over London, and the bells rang for her new reign, the same walls that echoed her triumph were already whispering the sound of her downfall. The court of Henry VIII was a theatre of masks, and every face that smiled hid another intention. Beneath the chandeliers of Whitehall and the tapestries that shimmered like jewels, power played its quiet game, and Catherine Howard, barely 17, had just become its newest piece. She had worn fine gowns before, but never silk so heavy, never jewels so sharp. Her coronation in the summer of 1540 was a spectacle of gold and exhaustion. The king, nearly 50, limped beside her with a cane, his vast frame draped in fur to hide the swelling of his leg and the rot beneath it. She looked radiant. He looked triumphant. And the crowd roared not for love, but for reassurance that England's king was still strong, that youth could cure decay. To Henry, Catherine was not simply a wife. She was a symbol, a promise that time could be reversed. He saw her as his resurrection, his redemption, after the humiliation of Anne of Cleves. Her laughter made him forget the stench of his ulcers. Her touch made him believe that God had not yet forsaken him. He gave her everything he thought she could desire: palaces, jewels, silks, bouquets, and titles. He called her my rose, without thorns. She called him Your Majesty. But in the silence between them, there was an abyss that no affection could bridge, the abyss of years. Two of desire turned into duty, of beauty imprisoned by fear. In public, they were a vision of harmony. In private, they were strangers. When the king's leg split open during the night, servants carried the stinking bandages through corridors that smelled of death. Catherine turned away and wept quietly into her sleeves. He saw her pity and mistook it for disgust. From that moment, the sweetness of his obsession soured. He became jealous, unpredictable, and cruel. The more she smiled, the more he doubted her love. But the young queen had been raised in a house where affection and danger had always walked side by side. She knew how to survive by pretending, by laughing at the right time, by looking grateful, even when terrified. Still, the court was a place where every whisper had an echo. The king's ministers, men like Archbishop Cranmer and Thomas Wriothesley, watched her carefully. They saw not a queen, but a distraction. To them, Henry's passion for Catherine was a threat to order. To the Howards, she was a fragile ladder to climb higher. Everyone around her wanted something, And she, caught in the middle, understood too late that she was surrounded not by courtiers, but by predators. At first, life at court seemed to bloom with joy. Catherine loved music, dancing, the bright colours of youth. She surrounded herself with women from her old life, foolish, playful girls who remembered the nights at Chesworth when laughter drowned out fear. Among them was Jane Rochford, widow of George Boleyn, the executed brother of Anne, the queen who had died before her. Jane had seen death up close and wore madness like a perfume. She clung to Catherine's side, feeding her vanity, warning her that kings grew bored quickly, that beauty must always find a way to remind men of what they desire. It was advice given like poison in a gilded cup. Henry, meanwhile, grew weaker. He could no longer ride. His leg poured infection. His body shook with fever. Yet his mind remained sharp enough to notice every glance. Catherine gave another man, and among those glances, one lingered too long. Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber, young, handsome, and reckless, began to haunt the queen's thoughts. He was everything. The king was not alive. Vibrant, unafraid, in another life, in another story, perhaps they would have been happy. But in Henry's world, happiness was always paid for in blood. Catherine tried to be a good wife, or at least the kind of wife the king expected. She played the dutiful queen, sitting by his bedside, reading softly while he groaned in pain. She kissed his hand, smiled at his courtiers, and told herself that obedience was safety. But the human heart has limits. One night, after a feast that left the court drunk with wine and music, she caught Culpeper's eyes across the hall, a look so fleeting and yet so dangerous that her pulse would not slow for hours after. He looked at her, not as a queen, but as a girl, and in that look, she remembered who she had been before the crown, before the rot, before the cold weight of royal duty crushed her breath. Their meetings began with innocence. A word here, a glance there, a walk in the garden longer than propriety allowed. But soon, the thrill of danger became a drug. Neither could resist. Jane Rochford, whose bitterness had turned to mischief, arranged the meetings. She knew the risk. She had seen how the king destroyed those he loved. And still, she whispered, "Be careful, but not too careful. Mendy for love every day. Queensdy only once." Henry, blinded by pride, saw only what he wished to see: a wife who smiled, who sang for him, who flattered him as no one else dared. He called her his angel, his salvation. But the courtiers had begun to whisper. Servants had begun to talk. One small rumour became another, and soon the truth, or some version of it, was winding its way toward the Archbishop's ear. For a time, Catherine still believed herself untouchable. She was the queen. After all, who would dare accuse her? Yet deep inside, perhaps she felt the shadow growing. The Tudor court was built on suspicion. It had consumed queens before. She would have known the stories of Anne Boleyn, her laughter, her fall, the echo of her final words. Sometimes, they said, Catherine walked the same hallways Anne had once walked, and paused, as if listening for something. Perhaps it was the wind. Perhaps it was the memory of a scream. The world outside the palace was changing too. England had broken from Rome, and the people were restless. The fires of heresy burned across the land. Henry's reign, once bright with promise, was now marked by fear and exhaustion. The king needed stability, and the young queen beautiful, naive, already too light for the heavy crown, would soon be asked to bear the weight of a nation's rage. But for now, in the brief glow before ruin, Catherine lived in fragile joy. She was adored, admired, envied, The king called her his jewel, the court called her his folly. And as autumn turned to winter, the frost gathered not only on the windows, but in the air around her name. She did not know it yet. But the palace had already become a prison. Every smile she gave was recorded. Every movement watched. The same walls that had witnessed her laughter were preparing to hear her confession. The same men who praised her would soon write her death warrant. And somewhere, deep in the corridors of Whitehall, Henry's ministers waited patient, silent, and ready to remind their king that even roses have thorns. For now, Catherine still danced, but history had already begun sharpening its blade. The summer of 1541 should have been a season of triumph. England glowed with festivals. The court glittered under sunlight and deceit. Catherine Howard, crowned and adored, was the very embodiment of Henry's illusion, the mirror that showed him not what he was, but what he wanted to be. Wherever she went, the crowd cheered. The old king smiled as if he had defied time. Yet every celebration hid the faint scent of rot, like fruit left too long in a golden bowl. Beneath the velvet and ceremony, cracks had begun to open. Henry's body was failing, and the pain had made him crueler. The ulcer on his leg, now as wide as a man's hand, never healed. It leaked blood and pus through the linen, staining his robes. The stench clung to him so fiercely that courtiers avoided standing too close, though none dared show it. The once athletic prince who had danced through banquets was now carried from room to room by servants, his breath heavy, his temper short, and yet he insisted on appearing in public towering, magnificent, terrifying, forcing England to look upon a god pretending not to die. Catherine, who had once found pity for him, now felt only dread. Each time he winced or groaned, she flinched, fearing the rage that often followed. Still, she smiled. A queen was expected to smile. Her duty was to be the light that covered the darkness spreading through the king's body. But youth, unlike power, cannot be commanded. At night, when she sat in her chambers, surrounded by women, too frightened to speak, she thought of Culpeper, of his voice, of his laughter, of the life she had almost lived. The letters they exchanged became her only freedom. "It makes my heart to die," she wrote, "that I cannot be always in your company." Her words trembled with innocence, not treason. Yet in this court, every heartbeat was evidence. The court was already changing. Men who had once flattered her now watched her with cautious distance. Archbishop Cranmer, that cold and calculating survivor of every royal storm, began to hear whispers about the Queen's past. They came from servants who knew too much, and ladies who envied her place. Someone mentioned the name Francis Derham, the lover of her youth, and suddenly the quiet hum of rumour became the roar of judgment. Cranmer did not confront her directly. He did what men of power always did. He watched. He waited. And he gathered the pieces of her destruction, one confession at a time. Catherine was not entirely blind to the danger. The Queen's household had begun to shrink around her, the laughter thinning like the last note of a dying song. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle and one-time protector, grew silent. The Howards, always quick to rise with fortune, were equally quick to scatter when ruin approached. She stood alone at the heart of a web that had once lifted her to glory. Now it tightened around her neck. Henry's moods shifted with terrifying speed. One day he called her his jewel. The next, he accused her of looking at other men. His affection was a blade, wrapped in velvet. His love, a cage that promised safety and delivered fear. Catherine began to move through the palace like a ghost, careful not to speak too long to anyone, careful not to meet too many eyes. She prayed more often now, but her prayers were confused half to God, half to the memory of freedom. It was in this atmosphere of tension that Archbishop Cranmer presented his findings to the king. He approached cautiously. knowing Henry's temper could kill a man faster than any sword. When he spoke of the Queen's former lovers, Henry's face darkened. But at first, he refused to believe it. The idea that his perfect rose had been touched by another was unbearable. He dismissed the accusation as slander. But when Cranmer produced witnesses, the women who had shared Catherine's dormitory, the servants who had carried her letters, something inside the king cracked. He demanded proof. He demanded names. He demanded that the world confirm what his pride could not accept. Cranmer obeyed. He sent men to question everyone who had ever known her. The interrogations were brutal. The answers twisted. The truth reshaped into something useful. In a few days, the Queen's past was rewritten as a tapestry of sin. Every laugh became flirtation. Every secret became treason. When Catherine heard the first rumours, she tried to dismiss them. When she realised Cranmer himself was leading the inquiry, she begged to see the king to explain, to cry, to beg forgiveness. But the gates of her own palace closed before she could reach him. Henry, in a fit of humiliation, had fled Hampton Court, leaving orders that no one was to approach the Queen. The guards locked her inside her apartments. The laughter that had once filled the corridors was gone. Only the echo of her footsteps remained. She called for her confessor. She called for her uncle. No one came. When she tried to write to the king, the letters were intercepted. She had become invisible, a ghost in silks, pacing the rooms where she had once danced. Outside, the ministers plotted the next move. The machinery of her downfall was already in motion, and she could not see it. Meanwhile, the king wept. Those who saw him said his grief was monstrous, not for love, but for shame. He had been made a fool again. His rage, once buried under sorrow, turned outward. He struck walls with his fists until blood covered his knuckles. He cursed God, women, and every man who had looked upon his queen. His fury needed an object, and soon the tower would have new prisoners to feed it. The accusations reached full form by November of 1541. Catherine was charged not only with infidelity, but with plotting to marry another after the king's death, a crime that turned gossip into treason. The council drew up the orders. Francis Derham was arrested and tortured. Thomas Culpeper followed. The truth they extracted under agony mattered less than the confession itself. The king's honour demanded blood, and blood would come. Within days, the young queen's world had shrunk to the size of a single room. The windows were sealed. The guards changed shifts without speaking. When she asked what was happening, no one answered. She understood then that silence was the sound of judgment. The woman who had once been the laughter of the court now heard only the sound of her own heartbeat. It echoed through the empty palace like a drum. She thought of Chesworth, of Francis, of the child she had been, and she wondered when had her story stopped belonging to her. Was it when she first smiled at the king, or when she first feared him outside? London waited. The people who had cheered her coronation now whispered about her sin. They said the king's young wife had been a temptress, that she had fooled him, that she was worse than Anne Boleyn. But in truth, she was neither saint nor sinner. She was simply young, and in the court of Henry VIII, youth was a crime that never went unpunished. By the time the winter frost settled over the Thames, Catherine's crown had already turned to iron. The Queen of England was no longer a woman, but a symbol, a reminder to every girl who dared to dream too brightly. The king's rose had withered, and the scent of her downfall filled the palace. In the quiet before dawn, the bells of Hampton Court rang low and slow, carrying the first notes of her ruin across the river. Somewhere in her locked chamber, Catherine must have heard them and understood. The sound that once celebrated her marriage now mourned her soul. And far away, in the cold corridors of the tower, a block of wood waited in silence, knowing, as all of England soon would, that the child who had been a queen was already walking toward it. Winter crept over London with a silence that pressed against the palace walls. Frost bloomed along the windows of Hampton Court, blurring the view of the river that once glittered beneath summer light. Within those cold corridors, Catherine Howard waited a queen trapped between the ghost of her former life and the terrible weight of the crown. She was still young, still radiant, still foolish enough to believe that love might yet save her from the loneliness that shadowed her every step. But in the Tudor court, love was never salvation. It was a weapon disguised as hope. When Thomas Culpeper first entered her orbit, it was like breathing again after too long beneath water. He was young, confident, and alive, the opposite of everything Henry had become. The king, now swollen with illness, spent his nights half awake in agony, his body soaked in fever, his temper sharpened by pain. Catherine, condemned to smile at a man whose touch made her flinch, sought warmth wherever she could find it. Culpeper gave her that warmth in glances, in words unspoken, in the dangerous comfort of being seen. Their first meetings were small rebellions against despair. A walk through the gardens longer than necessary, a conversation that lingered too late. The Queen's ladies noticed. Of course, everything was noticed in the palace, but who could blame her? She was surrounded by old men and fear. To speak with a man her own age was to remember that she was still human. Yet even innocence becomes treason when seen through the eyes of envy. Jane Rochford became their messenger, the widow of George Boleyn. Haunted by memories of another queen's death, her face carried the look of a woman who had already seen too much and had stopped caring about consequences. She arranged the meetings, whispered the words that would unravel Catherine's life. Perhaps she believed she was helping. Perhaps she wanted company in her own ruin. Whatever her reasons, the chain had begun. And once forged, it could not be broken. The meetings took place in silence and shadow. At night, when the court slept, Catherine would slip from her chambers, her heart pounding beneath the layers of velvet. Rochford stood watch at the door. Culpeper waited in the darkness beyond a man risking his life for moments that would vanish with the dawn. They never spoke loudly. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. He would kiss her hands, her hair, whisper that he loved her, that he would rather die than lose her. Words that would soon become prophecy. The letters began not long after. They were written in trembling hands, carried by trembling servants, hidden in the folds of gowns and gloves. Catherine's letters were full of longing. Desperate, naive. It makes my heart to die. She wrote, to think I cannot always be with you. Those lines would one day be read aloud in a courtroom, twisted from affection into evidence. The more they met, the closer the walls seemed to draw in. Servants began to talk softly, carefully, but enough to be heard by those who listened for whispers. One maid noticed the Queen's chamber door left open at strange hours. Another claimed to have seen Culpeper in the garden at night. In Henry's England, rumour was more lethal than proof. And Cranmer, patient as ever, listened to every whisper. But Catherine could not stop. Desire had become her only rebellion. The king, swollen and stinking, was her duty. Culpeper, reckless and warm, was her escape. When she looked at him, she saw the girl. She had once been the one who danced barefoot at Chesworth, who laughed before she learned to be afraid. Love was a memory of freedom, and she clung to it as though it might make her real again. Outside their secret world, the palace hummed with tension. The courtiers smiled at the Queen but kept their distance. The Howard family began to sense danger. Their sudden silence was louder than any warning. Henry himself remained unaware, blind to the storm gathering at his feet. He bragged that his young wife made him feel young again. Though his body betrayed him with every step, he trusted her more than he trusted his own ministers. And that trust, fragile, desperate, absolute, would soon shatter into rage. The trap closed quietly. One servant, frightened by the rumours, confessed to Archbishop Cranmer. She spoke of secret meetings, of midnight walks, of letters passed in candlelight. Cranmer, who had seen queens fall before, recognized the pattern immediately. He began collecting statements, one after another, until the whispers became a case. But he waited. He knew better than to confront the king with half a truth. Catherine, unaware, spent her last days of freedom, surrounded by luxury she could no longer enjoy. Each smile felt heavier, each gesture rehearsed. The world around her had turned into a stage she could not step off. She felt eyes everywhere behind curtains, behind laughter, behind prayers. Even the walls seemed to listen. One evening, as she sat before her mirror, she found a single grey thread woven into her golden hair. It was small, invisible to anyone else, but she saw it and understood what it meant. Youth fades, beauty dies, and in the court of Henry VIII, love is the first thing that rots. Her last meeting with Culpeper was quiet. They said little, because there was nothing left to say. The candle between them burned low. They both knew it could not last. When he left, she watched his shadow disappear through the archway and felt, for the first time, the weight of the tower pressing down on her, though she had not yet been sent there. The night was still. The court slept, and somewhere in the silence, a single truth whispered through the halls that the Queen's heart, once given, could never be taken back. By morning, her name would no longer be spoken in love, but in accusation. The letters would be found, the servants would confess, and the same men who once bowed before her would begin sharpening the blade that would take her head. For Catherine Howard, the secret meetings had ended. The silence that followed would last forever. When the sun rose over London that November, the river carried a strange stillness with it. The barges that usually ferried nobles to court floated idle, and the sound of church bells seemed muted, as though the city itself knew it was about to watch another queen fall. Catherine Howard, once the laughter of the palace, was now its ghost. The air around her name had changed it, no longer carried perfume and music, but the iron tang of fear. The investigation moved like a shadow through the halls. Archbishop Cranmer and the King's Council gathered testimony from anyone who had ever known her. No name was too small, no rumour too absurd. Servants, tutors, old companions, all were summoned, questioned, and turned into instruments of her undoing. Some spoke truth, others lied to protect themselves. But it made no difference. The story they built was one the king was ready to believe. Henry, humiliated and sick with rage, demanded answers. His pride, always larger than his mercy, could not bear the thought that his young wife had deceived him. He had loved her with the desperation of an old man clinging to his youth, and that made the betrayal unbearable. The same lips that had called her his rose without thorns now spat curses in the council chamber. Kill them all, he is said to have shouted, and let God sort their souls. Catherine, meanwhile, was confined to her apartments. Unaware that her life was already being dismantled outside her locked door, the guards no longer bowed. The laughter of her ladies had turned to silence. When she asked for her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, no answer came. The Howards, once her greatest allies, now distanced themselves as if her name were a disease. They had built her throne, and now they built her gallows. The first to fall was Francis Derham, dragged from his home and thrown into the Tower. He was tortured until his voice broke, under the agony of the rack. He confessed everything and more. Every word Catherine had ever spoken to him twisted into proof of her wickedness. Thomas Culpeper followed soon after, his handsome face bloodied and unrecognizable by the time he too confessed. Their statements, written in trembling ink, were carried to the king like trophies. Henry read them alone. his breath heavy, his face pale. When he finished, he wept not for her, but for himself. On November 23rd, the council formally accused Catherine of treason. The word itself was enough to end her life. The law declared that any queen who betrayed her husband's bed betrayed his crown, and any betrayal of the crown was a crime against God. She would not be given a trial in the way common people were. The Queen's guilt was a matter of royal shame, and shame in Henry's England was always answered with death. When the order was read to her, Catherine refused to believe it. She fell to her knees, begging to see the king. "Let me speak to him," she cried, "for I will make him believe my innocence." But no messenger was sent. Henry had already left Hampton Court, retreating to London to escape the smell of her disgrace. She chased him through locked doors, screaming, until the guards had to hold her down. Her cries echoed through the palace, a sound that servants would remember for the rest of their lives. In the Tower, her lovers awaited their end. Francis Derham was executed first. His body hanged, drawn, and quartered his limbs, displayed as warnings across the city. Thomas Culpeper's sentence was merciful, only by comparison beheading. He faced the axe with quiet dignity, perhaps still imagining the Queen's voice somewhere beyond the walls, whispering his name. Jane Rochford, who had arranged their meetings, was declared mad. But Parliament passed a special act so that even madness could no longer save a traitor. She too was condemned to die. Catherine heard of their deaths from her guards. She did not cry. She asked for a priest. But when he came, she had no confession left to give. She spoke little, only murmured prayers. The world outside her chamber continued its dance of politics and cruelty. The courtiers gossiping, the ambassadors sending coded letters to their masters, the people whispering that the Queen had been no better than Anne Boleyn. But within that locked room, time had stopped. The Act of Attainder passed swiftly through Parliament, sealing her fate without need for trial or defence. Even those who pitied her voted for her death. No one dared to stand against the king's will. She was stripped of her title, Herr Jewels, and her name. From that moment, she was no longer Queen Catherine of England. She was simply the Lady Catherine Howard, a prisoner awaiting execution. Henry refused to see her, though she begged again and again. He said she had broken his heart, and he would not risk breaking it further by looking into her eyes. But the truth was simpler. He could not bear to face the reflection of his own failure. He had made her queen, and now she would die because he had chosen to love her. In the final days before her execution, Catherine grew strangely calm. The wildness that had once made her irresistible was gone, replaced by a quiet resignation. She prayed often, not for life, but for courage. One of her attendants said she would stand by the window for hours, watching the grey sky above the Thames. Sometimes she would speak softly, as if to herself, "If only I had been taught better." She once whispered, "If only I had known what it means to be loved." The night before she was taken to the Tower, she asked for the block to be brought to her room. The guards hesitated. It was an unusual request, but she insisted. When it arrived, she knelt before it, placing her neck upon the wood again and again, practicing the moment she would die. She wanted to make it quick, graceful, clean. She wanted to die as a queen, not as a frightened girl. By dawn, the preparations were complete. The executioner was summoned. The Tower awaited. Outside, the winter sky turned pale, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside her chamber, Catherine rose from her bed, dressed in black velvet, and whispered a final prayer. She was 19, and though the court would move on, though Henry would find another wife to wear the ring she once wore, the shadow of her death would never leave him, for in killing Catherine, he had not silenced scandal, He had only reminded England that its king had a heart that could still be broken, and that he would rather spill blood than admit it. Thus ended the trial of a teenage queen not in a courtroom, but in the quiet of her own fear, judged by a man who could no longer tell the difference between love and shame. The morning she was taken from Hampton Court, London was veiled in mist. The river flowed slow and grey, as though reluctant to carry her fate. Soldiers surrounded her, their armour shining dully beneath the pale sun. Catherine Howard, no longer a queen, walked between them without resistance. She did not weep. She looked around her at the palace where she had once danced, at the faces that would not meet her eyes, and she smiled faintly, as if she had at last understood what all this had meant. The barge that carried her down the Thames rocked softly with the current. Its oars cut through the water with rhythmic precision, each stroke an echo of inevitability. The guards stood silent. Only the tolling of church bells followed them, distant but relentless, marking the passing of another condemned soul through the veins of the city. As they passed under London Bridge, she did not look up at the tar-blackened heads that lined the spikes. Perhaps she already knew that her own would soon join them. When the tower came into view, its grey walls rose like the edge of the world. Ravens circled overhead. The boat slipped quietly beneath the Traitor's Gate, the same archway that had swallowed Anne Boleyn before her. The water lapped against the stone with a sound like breathing. Inside, the soldiers led her across the cobbled yard, past the Beauchamp Tower, past the Queen's house, where her cousin had once wept. The air smelled of salt and metal. She felt its cold bite against her skin, and thought, almost peacefully, this is where all the stories end. The room prepared for her was small, dim, and clean. The guards, almost gentle, left her with a priest and a single candle. The walls were bare, save for a cross carved into the stone by another prisoner long ago. She traced it with her fingertips, wondering whose prayer it had been and whether it had been answered. In the days that followed, she lived between prayer and silence. Her attendants, frightened but loyal, spoke little. They brushed her hair, brought her food she could not eat, and listened as she murmured fragments of hymns. Sometimes she would ask what the weather was like beyond the walls. Sometimes she would ask if the king still thought of her. They never answered. One evening, as the candle burned low, she asked for the block again. The lieutenant of the tower, a man not unkind, hesitated but obeyed. The wooden block, worn smooth by other heads, was set upon the floor. Catherine Kate placed her hands upon it and lowered her neck. She stayed there for a moment, then lifted her head and smiled a small, calm smile that frightened the man more than tears ever could. She practiced this several times until she was satisfied. "I will not tremble," she whispered. "I will do well." She spent her final night awake. The guards outside heard her singing softly the same song, over and over, until her voice faded into the dawn. When they entered at first light, she was already dressed, her hair pinned neatly, her face pale but composed. She asked for the priest. He prayed with her, gave her absolution, and she thanked him with the grace of a woman twice her age. At breakfast, she refused food, but accepted a cup of wine. She sipped it slowly, looking through the narrow slit of the window, where a strip of sky showed pale blue. "It is a fine day," she said. The lieutenant nodded, unable to speak. He had seen many prisoners taken to the scaffold, but none as young, none as strangely serene. As they led her out, the bells of the Tower Chapel began to ring. The courtyard was crowded guards, courtiers, curious onlookers. The scaffold stood ready, black draped, the axe gleaming beneath the pale morning light. The wind tugged at her veil, as she climbed the wooden steps. For a moment, the crowd saw not a condemned woman, but a vision, a girl dressed in black velvet, her hands white as bone, her face calm as marble. When she reached the top, she turned to the assembled witnesses and spoke. Her voice, though soft, carried across the square. "I be a queen," she said, "but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." The words hung in the air like incense, not defiance, not regret, but truth. It was the first honest thing she had been allowed to say since she wore the crown. She knelt gracefully. As she had practiced, she placed her neck upon the block, her hands folded in prayer. The executioner, trembling, asked her forgiveness, and she gave it freely. "I forgive you," she said. "Do it quickly." The blade rose. It fell once, and in that moment, the air itself seemed to stop breathing. The crowd bowed their heads. No one spoke. The executioner stepped back. Her body, now lifeless, was carried away to be buried beside Anne Boleyn, the aunt she had never known, whose shadow she had unknowingly followed from the cradle to the grave. By midday, the court already had a new decree drafted, a new silence imposed. Her name was struck from prayers, her portrait removed, but the tower kept her story. In the years that followed, guards would whisper that on quiet nights, when the river was still, they could hear soft footsteps in the courtyard, a faint rustle of skirts, and a girl's voice singing a broken lullaby to no one at all. Catherine Howard had entered history the way she had lived, young, bright, and far too human for the world that devoured her. And though her death brought silence to the court, it left behind a sound that England would never forget, the echo of a girl who learned too late that love in a king's house is always the most dangerous sin. When the axe fell, the kingdom did not tremble. London carried on as it always had. The butchers opened their stalls, the bells of St. Paul's tolled the hour, and the river flowed past the tower with indifferent calm. Yet somewhere in Whitehall Palace, the man who had ordered her death sat in silence, staring into the empty air, as if waiting for the world to end. Henry VIII, King of England, had killed love again. They said he did not eat that day. The servants brought platters of roasted meat and spiced wine, but he waved them away. He asked no questions about the execution. He did not need to. He already knew how it would have gone. The kneeling, the breath, the blade, the silence. He had seen it before, too many times. But this time, something inside him refused to settle. He had called Catherine his joy, his redemption, his second youth. And now that she was gone, the palace itself seemed colder. The laughter of courtiers echoed through halls that smelled faintly of death. For weeks, Henry shut himself away. His doctors spoke of pain, of ulcers, of infection, but those who served him whispered of something deeper of nights when he woke screaming, drenched in sweat, shouting her name. The sound carried through the corridors like a curse. He claimed to see her in the darkness, her hair unbound, her eyes wet with tears. Once, he swore she stood at the foot of his bed, her lips moving soundlessly as if forgiving him, or perhaps damning him. The courtiers began to avoid his presence. Ministers spoke to him in whispers, afraid of the madness that flickered behind his eyes. He raged at his priests, at his council, at God himself. He demanded to know why he had been betrayed again, why every woman he touched turned to dust. But there was no answer, only the echo of his own guilt. He had built his kingdom on the bones of wives and friends, and now the weight of that empire pressed upon him like a tomb. Winter thickened over England. The frost crept along the palace windows. The fires burned low, and the king's leg worsened. The stench of rot followed him wherever he went. Sometimes, as he was carried through the corridors, Servants caught glimpses of him muttering to himself, his face pale and waxen, his eyes hollow. He spoke to no one, except to her, always to her. "My Catherine," he whispered once to a frightened page. She was only a child. In the council chambers, life continued. New treaties were drafted. New taxes proposed. New wives suggested. But the shadow of Catherine Howard clung to the air. Her name was forbidden at court. Yet every silence seemed to speak of her. Even the musicians avoided playing the songs she had once danced to, fearing the king's wrath. He claimed to want peace. But there could be no peace for a man haunted by what he had destroyed. Henry's enemies abroad mocked him quietly. The French called him the widower king. In Rome, priests whispered that God had abandoned him long ago. But Henry still ruled by fear, and fear, like rot, endures. No one dared tell him that his reign had become a monument to decay, that beneath the gilded armour and royal mottos, there was only a broken man who could not forgive himself. Sometimes, late at night, he ordered his servants to bring him her letters. The ones she had written to Culpeper. He would read them by candlelight, the flame trembling as if it, too, feared the words, "It makes my heart to die." She had written, "To think I cannot always be with you." He read the line again and again until the paper tore beneath his fingers. Then he would throw it into the fire and watch it burn, as if destroying the words could erase their truth. But even ashes remember. By spring, he began to speak of marriage again, not from love, but from habit. His advisers pressed him toward another alliance. He listened, nodded, and agreed. But the fire that had once made him dangerous was fading. The great Lion of England had grown old. His heart, swollen and diseased, beat slower with every season. When he looked in the mirror, he saw not a king, but a corpse waiting for its coffin, and behind him, reflected faintly in the glass, was always her young, smiling, alive in memory. The courtiers learned not to mention the Tower, not to speak of February, not to wear black in his presence. Yet nothing could erase the truth that everyone knew Henry Tudor had not just executed another wife. He had executed the last piece of himself that was capable of love. When night fell, he often sat alone beside the fire, the light flickering over his scarred hands. He would close his eyes and hear the echo of her voice. Faint as breath. "I die a queen," she had said, "but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." He hated those words. He admired them. He envied them, because in the end, she had found the courage. He never could the courage to tell the truth. In his final years, when illness made him half mad, and the smell of his own body filled every room, he would sometimes whisper her name before sleep. No prayers, no apologies, just a name. And though history would remember him as the king of 6 wives, the reformer, the tyrant, the maker of England, the truth was simpler. Henry VIII died haunted by a 19-year-old girl whose only crime had been to love, and in the stillness of the Tower, where ravens still circle above the grey stone, the wind carries her song soft, broken, endless. The king's nightmare had become her freedom. For in death, Catherine Howard finally belonged to no one. Years passed, and the story of Catherine Howard faded from the court's tongue, replaced by new marriages, new scandals, new farce. England moved forward as it always did, grinding its ghosts into the dust of progress. But some ghosts, the quiet ones, never leave. They linger in corners of history, not as screams, but as whispers too soft to ignore. Catherine's whisper was one of them, the sound of silk against stone, of youth meeting the cold edge of power. Henry VIII outlived her by 5 years. They were long, diseased, Miserable years. Filled with regret he refused to name. He married once more to Catherine Parr, a clever, careful woman who knew how to survive the ruins of his love. She soothed his temper, read to him when his eyes failed, and prayed for his soul when he no longer could. Yet even she could not lift the shadow that Catherine Howard had left behind. Sometimes, as Henry lay half-conscious in his bed at Whitehall, his mind lost in fever, he would reach into the darkness and call for my girl. The servants pretended not to hear. They knew whom he meant. They said that once, in his delirium, he asked them to send for her, that he had something to confess before he died. But the room was empty, and no confession ever came. When he finally died in January of 1547, the priests claimed that his last words were prayers. But one page, too young to know the value of discretion, swore that the king's final breath carried a woman's name, whispered softly, like a plea. If it was true, no one wrote it down. History, after all, has no place for tenderness in tyrants. Catherine Howard was buried without ceremony, her grave unmarked, her name blackened in official records. Yet in the quiet of the tower, her presence endured. The guards told stories they were not supposed to tell, of footsteps that echoed where no one walked, of laughter that floated down from the Queen's house long after midnight. They said that sometimes, when the moon was high and the river mist crept over the courtyard, a figure in white appeared near the scaffold, moving slowly, as if retracing the path she had walked to her death. The ravens never approached her. Even they seemed to understand. But the truth of Catherine's haunting was not in ghosts. It was in memory. Her story lived on in the way England remembered its queens, how the powerful were forgiven, but the young were punished. How the women who loved too much were always the ones who bled for it. Her cousin Anne Boleyn had been accused of lust. Her stepdaughter Elizabeth would be accused of pride. But Catherine's sin was simpler. She had believed that love could exist in a world built on fear. Century later, visitors to the tower still walk past her cell without realizing that the air they breathe once carried the last sigh of a girl who had everything and nothing at all. Some swear the chamber feels colder than the rest of the fortress, that their footsteps sound different there. The guides call it imagination. But perhaps it isn't. Perhaps what they feel is not fear, but recognition, that fragile reminder that innocence never survives in the presence of power. For Catherine Howard's story is not about death. It is about how the world destroys what it desires most. Her beauty made her queen. Her honesty made her dangerous. Her youth made her unforgettable. And though her body turned to dust, her echo remained in the hush of the river beneath the traitor's gate, in the cry of the ravens circling the tower, in the uneasy dreams of a king who once called her his rose without thorns. The tower still stands. The Thames still runs. The stone still remembers. And somewhere, between the walls where history sleeps and the sky where mercy never came, the echo of Catherine Howard lingers, not a scream, not a sob, but a sigh that never ends. A sigh that says, softly, I die a queen, but I would rather die for love. The story ends where it began, with a girl too bright for her own time, and a crown too heavy for her heart. The rest is silence.